The afternoon sun blazed through the small windows of Flight 447 as passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, searching for their assigned seats. The Boeing 737 was nearly full, carrying its usual mix of business travelers, families, and vacationers on the 3-hour journey from Kansas City to Los Angeles. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the Missouri heat that had followed passengers through the jet bridge. Meredith Ash, a 67-year-old woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, clutched her boarding pass with one hand and her oversized purse with the other. Her floral dress and pearl necklace suggested someone who took pride in her appearance, someone who valued tradition and proper behavior. She moved slowly down the aisle, checking seat numbers with the methodical precision of someone who always double-checked everything. Behind her, her friend Beverly Summers followed, chatting about their upcoming weekend in California. "Row 12, seats A and B," Meredith announced to Beverly, stopping abruptly at their assigned row. But as she looked up from her boarding pass, her expression changed dramatically. Her eyes widened, then narrowed with obvious displeasure. Sitting in seats 12C and 12D were Jake Sullivan and Marcus Chen, a couple in their early 30s who had been quietly discussing their vacation plan. Jake, a tall man with kind eyes and a warm smile, was showing Marcus something on his phone. Marcus, more reserved but equally pleasant, was leaning in close to see the screen. "Excuse me," Meredith said sharply, her voice cutting through the gentle hum of passenger conversation. "I believe there's been some mistake." She waved her boarding pass in the air, though she hadn't actually checked if she was in the right place. Jake and Marcus looked up, confused by her tone. "These are our seats," Jake said politely, holding up their boarding passes. "12C and 12D. Are you sure you're in the right row?" Meredith's face flushed red, and she took a step back into the aisle. "I am absolutely certain I'm in the right row," she declared, her voice growing louder. "But I am equally certain that I will not be sitting next to, she gestured vaguely at the couple, unable or unwilling to complete her sentence. Several passengers in nearby rows began to turn their heads, sensing the beginning of a confrontation. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't understand," Marcus said gently, genuine confusion in his voice. "Is there something wrong with our seats?" The question seemed to ignite something in Meredith. "You know perfectly well what's wrong," she snapped, her voice now loud enough for passengers several rows away to hear clearly. "I paid good money for this flight, and I have the right not to be forced to sit next to people like you." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Conversations throughout the cabin began to die down as passengers realized something uncomfortable was happening. Jake's face went pale, and he instinctively reached for Marcus's hand. "People like us?" Marcus asked quietly, though he clearly understood exactly what Meredith meant. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. "Don't play innocent with me," Meredith continued, her voice rising with each word. "I was raised with proper Christian value, and I shouldn't have to be subjected to your lifestyle choice. It's indecent, and it's wrong, and I won't sit here and pretend otherwise." She crossed her arms defiant, as if daring anyone to challenge her. The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. Beverly tugged gently on Meredith's arm, whispering, "Meredith, please," but her friend shook her off. Jake and Marcus exchanged glances, both clearly mortified by the public nature of the confrontation. Other passengers began to stare openly now, some with disapproval at Meredith's words, others with curiosity about how the situation would unfold. Rebecca Thompson, an experienced flight attendant with 15 years of service, hurried over from the front of the cabin. She had handled difficult passengers before, but the tension in the air was palpable. "Is there a problem here?" she asked diplomatically, though she had heard enough to understand the situation. "Perhaps we can resolve this quietly." "The problem," Meredith announced loudly, "is that I am being forced to sit next to people whose behavior I find morally objectionable. I have rights as a paying passenger, and one of those rights is not to be made uncomfortable by inappropriate displays." She looked around the cabin, as if expecting support from other passengers. Instead, she found mostly shocked faces and disapproving stares. From several rows back, a tall figure began to stand up. Travis Kelce, recognizable to many of the passengers, had been quietly observing the confrontation. His presence was immediately felt throughout the cabin, not because of his fame, but because of the quiet authority he carried. He stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Jake squeezed Marcus's hand tighter, both men now visibly shaken. The confrontation had escalated beyond their worst fears, and they found themselves trapped in their seats, unwilling subjects of a public spectacle. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The airplane engines hummed steadily, but inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Travis took a step forward, then another. His movement caught Meredith's attention, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed to hesitate. Something in his calm, measured approach suggested this was not a man who would be easily dismissed or ignored. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone's character and change the atmosphere of the entire flight. Rebecca Thompson, drawing on her extensive training in conflict resolution, approached the situation with professional calm. "Ma'am, I understand you're uncomfortable, but we need to find a solution that works for everyone," she said to Meredith, keeping her voice low and diplomatic. "Perhaps we can see if there's another available seat that might be more suitable for you." Her tone was respectful, but firm, designed to de-escalate the situation without validating Meredith's discriminatory language. Meredith seemed momentarily taken aback by the flight attendant's measured response. She had expected immediate acquiescence to her demand, not negotiation. "Well, yes, I suppose that would be acceptable," she said, her voice slightly less strident than before. "As long as it's comparable to what I paid for. I'm not moving to some middle seat in the back of the plane." Beverly nodded encouragingly, clearly hoping her friend would accept any reasonable alternative. Rebecca consulted her tablet, scrolling through the seat assignments with practiced efficiency. "Let me check what we have available," she said, buying time while she assessed the situation. Jake and Marcus remained frozen in their seats, afraid to move, speak, lest they somehow make the situation worse. The attention of the entire cabin was focused on their row, and both men felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. "I have a middle seat in row 23, Rebecca announced after a few moments. "It's still in the main cabin, and the flight isn't too long. Would that work for you?" Meredith's face immediately scrunched up in displeasure. She looked back toward row 23, then at Beverly, who was seated beside her in the window seat. "That's halfway back in the plane," she protested, "and it's between two strangers. I booked these seats specifically to sit with my friend." The logic of her complaint was lost on most observers, given that she was refusing to sit with Jake and Marcus, who were also strangers. But Meredith seemed oblivious to the contradiction. "Besides," she continued, "that puts me in the middle of the row. I hate middle seats. I get claustrophobic." She shook her head decisively. "No, that won't work at all. There has to be something better." Rebecca checked her tablet again, though she already knew the answer. "I'm sorry, but that's the only available seat on this flight. Everything else is taken." She looked sympathetic but resolute. "If you'd like, I can see if anyone would be willing to trade seats with you, but I can't force anyone to move." The implication was clear. Meredith would have to choose between the available seat or staying where she was. For a moment, it seemed as though Meredith might accept the compromise. She looked at the middle seat, then at Beverly, then at Jake and Marcus, who were still holding hands and trying to make themselves as small as possible. "I suppose I could manage it for a few hours," she said reluctantly. Beverly squeezed her arm encouragingly. "It's not so bad, Meredith. It's just until we land." Jake felt a surge of relief wash over him. Marcus let out a barely audible sigh, and his grip on his boyfriend's hand loosened slightly. Several passengers who had been watching the confrontation began to turn back to their own conversation, assuming the crisis had passed. Rebecca smiled professionally, clearly pleased that her diplomatic approach had worked. But as Meredith gathered her purse and began to move toward the back of the plane, she suddenly stopped. She looked at the middle seat again, then at the passengers who would be her seatmate, a large man with a briefcase and a woman with a crying baby. Her expression darkened once more. "Actually, no," she announced loudly. "This is ridiculous. I shouldn't have to give up my comfortable seat because of other people's choices." She turned and marched back toward row 12, her heels clicking sharply on the airplane floor. "I paid for seat 12A, and that's where I'm going to sit. If anyone has a problem with that, they can find somewhere else to go." The relief that had momentarily filled the cabin evaporated instantly. Jake and Marcus exchanged looks of despair, realizing their ordeal was far from over. "Ma'am, please," Rebecca said, following Meredith back up the aisle. "I thought we had reached an agreement." But Meredith was no longer interested in compromise. "I changed my mind," she declared, squeezing past Jake and Marcus to reach her window. "This is my seat, and I'm sitting in it, but I want everyone to know that I am not happy about this situation. As she settled into her seat, Meredith made a point of turning her body away from Jake and Marcus, pressing herself against the window, as if trying to maintain as much distance as possible. "I just want to make it clear," she said loudly enough for multiple rows to hear, "that I find this whole situation morally objectionable. I was raised with proper value, and I believe in the sanctity of traditional relationship." The words hit Jake and Marcus like physical blows. Marcus's eyes filled with tears, and he turned to look out the window, trying to hide his emotion. Jake felt a mixture of anger and humiliation, but also a protective instinct toward his partner. He wanted to respond, to defend their right to simply exist, but he also didn't want to escalate the situation further. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Jake said quietly, his voice barely audible above the airplane's ambient noise. "We're just trying to get to Los Angeles, same as you." His tone was respectful and non-confrontational, but Meredith seemed to interpret his words as a challenge. "Don't you dare try to make me feel guilty," she snapped. "I have every right to my opinions and my beliefs." The confrontation showed no signs of ending, and the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. Other passengers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, caught between wanting to intervene and not wanting to make the situation worse. Travis Kelce, still standing several rows back, continued to watch the scene unfold, his expression thoughtful and increasingly concerned. The airplane taxied slowly toward the runway, but the tension in the cabin made the brief delay feel interminable. Diane Foster, a middle-aged woman sitting across the aisle from the conflict, could no longer remain silent. She had been watching the situation with growing discomfort, and Meredith's continued hostility finally pushed her to act. "Excuse me," she said, leaning across the aisle toward Meredith. "I think you're being unnecessarily harsh. These gentlemen aren't bothering anyone." Meredith turned to face Diane, her expression defensive but slightly less certain than before. "I'm not being harsh," she protested. "I'm simply standing up for my beliefs. There's nothing wrong with having moral standards." But there was something in Diane's calm, reasonable tone that seemed to penetrate Meredith's armor of righteous indignation. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked genuinely uncertain. "Of course, there's nothing wrong with having beliefs," Diane replied gently, "but there's also nothing wrong with treating people with basic respect and kindness. These men are just traveling, like all of us. They're not forcing their beliefs on you or asking you to change your mind about anything. They're just trying to get from Kansas City to Los Angeles in peace." Other passengers began to nod in agreement with Diane's words. Samuel Rodriguez, a businessman in his 40s, sitting in the row in front of Jake and Marcus, turned around to face Meredith. "The lady's right," he said firmly. "You're causing a scene over nothing. These guys are just sitting here quietly. The only person making anyone uncomfortable is you." The criticism from multiple sources seemed to affect Meredith more than Rebecca's diplomatic approach had. She looked around the cabin and realized that most of the passengers were indeed looking at her with disapproval, not sympathy. Her face reddened, but this time it seemed to be from embarrassment rather than anger. I'm not trying to cause a scene," she said, her voice noticeably quieter than before. Beverly, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should just focus on having a pleasant flight," she suggested to her friend. "It's only a few hours." Meredith nodded reluctantly, seeming to accept that she had lost the battle for public opinion. "Fine," she said, settling back in her seat. "I'll try to keep my opinions to myself." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. He turned to Marcus, who was still looking out the window, and squeezed his hand gently. "Hey," he whispered, "I think it's going to be okay." Marcus turned back to him with a weak smile. "I hope so," he replied quietly. "I just want to get to LA and forget this whole thing happened." The airplane finally reached the runway and began its takeoff roll. The familiar sensation of acceleration and lift seemed to ease some of the tension in the cabin. Passengers began to relax, conversations resumed, and the flight attendants started their safety demonstration. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the crisis had passed, and the flight would continue without further incident. But as the airplane climbed toward cruising altitude, it encountered some turbulence. The aircraft shook and bounced, causing passengers to grip their armrests and look around nervously. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some moderate turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." During a particularly strong jolt, Marcus instinctively reached out and grabbed Jake's arm. It was a completely natural reaction, the kind of thing anyone might do when startled or frightened. Jake immediately put his other hand over Marcus's, offering comfort and reassurance. "It's okay," he whispered. "Just some bumps. We'll be through it in a minute." The gesture was tender and completely innocent, but it had an immediate and devastating effect on Meredith. She had been trying to ignore the couple, but the sudden movement caught her attention. When she saw Marcus holding Jake's arm and Jake's protective response, something inside her snapped. All the restraint she had shown after the criticism from other passengers evaporated in an instant. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she exploded, her voice cutting through the airplane noise like a knife. "I cannot and will not be subjected to this kind of inappropriate display. It's disgusting, it's wrong, and I shouldn't have to witness it." Her voice was so loud that passengers throughout the cabin turned to stare, and even the flight attendants in the galley looked up in alarm. Jake and Marcus immediately separated their hands as if they had been burned. Both men looked mortified and confused. "We weren't doing anything wrong," Jake said, his voice shaking slightly. He was just scared of the turbulence, but Meredith beyond reason now. "Don't you dare try to justify that behavior to me," she snarled. "I have eyes, and I saw what I saw." The confrontation had escalated beyond anything that had happened before. Other passengers were no longer just uncomfortable. They were actively angry. Samuel Rodriguez turned around fully and his face flushed with indignation. "Lady, you are completely out of line," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "These men did absolutely nothing wrong. The only disgusting thing here is your behavior and your bigotry. How dare you speak to me like that?" Meredith shot back, standing up despite the turbulence and the seatbelt sign. "I am a paying passenger on this flight, and I have rights. I have the right to express my religious beliefs, and I have the right not to be forced to watch immoral behavior." She was gesticulating wildly now, her voice approaching a shriek. The airplane gave another strong jolt, and Meredith had to grab the seat back to keep from falling. But even the physical reminder of where she was didn't calm her down. "This is exactly what's wrong with society today," she continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the cabin. "Nobody has any respect for traditional values anymore. Everyone thinks they can just do whatever they want without any consequences." The cabin fell into a stunned silence. Even the airplane seemed to quiet down, as if the turbulence was taking a break to see how this human drama would unfold. Jake and Marcus sat frozen in their seats, both men looking as though they wanted to disappear entirely. The weight of the entire airplane's attention was focused on their row, and the humiliation was almost unbearable. That's when Travis Kelce, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with growing concern, finally decided he had seen enough. He stood up slowly, his considerable height making him visible to everyone in the cabin. His movement was deliberate and calm, but there was something in his bearing that commanded immediate attention. Every eye in the airplane turned to him. Travis moved up the aisle with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in the spotlight, but his demeanor was completely different from his usual public persona. There was no showboating, no theatrics, just a quiet determination and an unmistakable sense of purpose. Passengers turned to watch him approach, and conversations throughout the cabin died away completely. Even Meredith, who had been ranting just moments before, found herself falling silent. When he reached row 12, Travis stopped and positioned himself directly in front of Meredith. He didn't loom over her threateningly, but his presence was unmistakable. "Ma'am," he said, in a voice that was calm but carried clearly throughout the cabin, "I'd like to have a word with you, if I may." His tone was respectful but firm, leaving no doubt that this was not really a request. Meredith looked up at him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed genuinely taken aback. Travis's celebrity status was certainly a factor, but it was more than that. There was something in his manner that suggested this was a man who was used to being listened to, not because of his fame, but because of his character. What do you want?" she asked, her earlier belligerence replaced by uncertainty. "I want to talk to you about respect," Travis said simply. "See, I was raised by parents who taught me that every person deserves basic human dignity, regardless of who they are or who they love. They taught me that judging people based on their personal relationships is wrong, and that standing by silently while someone is being mistreated makes you part of the problem." He gestured gently toward Jake and Marcus, who were watching the exchange with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "These two gentlemen aren't doing anything wrong. They're not hurting anyone. They're not bothering anyone. And they're not forcing their beliefs on anyone. They're just trying to travel from one city to another, same as you and me. But my religion, Meredith began, but Travis held up a hand to stop her. Ma'am, I respect your right to your religious belief. I truly do. But I also know that most religions teach love, compassion, and treating others the way you'd want to be treated. What you're doing right now doesn't seem to reflect those values. The airplane had grown so quiet that the only sounds were the engines and the air conditioning. Even the flight attendants had stopped their service to watch the exchange. Travis continued, his voice never rising above a conversational level, but somehow filling the entire cabin. I have to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. If you were traveling with someone you loved and a stranger started screaming at you and calling your relationship disgusting, how would that make you feel? Meredith's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she seemed to be genuinely considering the impact of her actions rather than simply defending her right to have them. Beverly, sitting beside her, reached over and took her hand. Meredith, she said quietly, maybe we should listen to what he's saying. Travis looked directly into Meredith's eye, and his expression softened slightly. I'm not trying to change your beliefs, ma'am. That's not my place, and it's not what I'm here for. But I am asking you to think about the difference between having beliefs and using those beliefs to hurt other people. Because that's what you're doing right now. You're hurting two people who have done nothing to deserve it. Jake and Marcus exchanged glances, both men clearly moved by Travis's words. Other passengers throughout the cabin were nodding in agreement, and several people were wiping away tears. The confrontation had transformed from an ugly display of prejudice into something else entirely, a teachable moment about human dignity and respect. I've been in locker rooms with men of all different backgrounds, beliefs, and orientation, Travis continued. I've played alongside guys who were gay, straight, religious, atheist, conservative, liberal, you name it. And you know what I learned? None of that matters when you're working toward a common goal. What matters is character, respect, and treating people right. He paused, letting his words sink in. These gentlemen aren't asking you to agree with their lifestyle or change your beliefs. They're just asking for the same basic respect that you'd want for yourself. And honestly, ma'am, that's not too much to ask. Meredith looked around the cabin, seeing the faces of her fellow passengers for the first time. She saw disapproval, yes, but also disappointment and sadness. She saw Jake and Marcus, who looked exhausted and hurt. She saw Beverly, whose expression was one of gentle encouragement mixed with embarrassment. And she saw Travis, who was looking at her not with anger or contempt, but with something that might have been hope. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The fight seemed to have gone out of her completely. I've always believed. I was taught. She trailed off, seeming to struggle with thoughts and feelings she had never examined before. Travis nodded understandingly. I get it. We all have things we were taught when we were young. But part of growing up is learning to think for ourselves and deciding what kind of people we want to be. The question isn't what you were taught. It's what you choose to do right now, in this moment, with these people. The airplane continued its journey through the sky, but inside the cabin, time seemed to stand still. Everyone was waiting to see how Meredith would respond to Travis's challenge. The confrontation had reached a turning point, and whatever happened next would determine whether the rest of the flight would be peaceful or continue to be marked by tension and hostility. Travis felt the weight of the entire cabin's attention on him, and for a moment, he questioned whether he had done the right thing. He thought about his younger brother Jason, who had struggled for years with his own identity and sexuality, afraid to come out to their family despite their generally accepting nature. He remembered the conversations they'd had, the tears his brother had shed, and the relief Jason had felt when he finally found the courage to be honest about who he was. Those memories fueled Travis's resolve, but they also made him aware of the delicate nature of the situation. Meredith was clearly struggling with beliefs that had been ingrained in her for decades, and he didn't want to humiliate her into submission. Real change, he knew, had to come from within. He could provide the catalyst, but she had to make the choice herself. Maybe I should just let this go, he thought briefly. She's an older woman, set in her ways. Maybe it's not fair to put her on the spot like this in front of all these people. He glanced around the cabin, seeing the expectant faces of fellow passengers. Some were clearly hoping he would continue to press the issue, while others seemed uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. But then he looked at Jake and Marcus again, and he saw something in their eyes that made his decision for him. It wasn't just hurt or embarrassment. It was a kind of resigned acceptance that this was simply how the world treated people like them. That look of defeat was something Travis had seen before, and it broke his heart every time. Meredith seemed to sense his internal struggle. "You're a good young man," she said quietly, "and I can see that you mean well. But you have to understand, I'm 67 years old. I've lived my entire life believing certain things. You can't just expect me to throw all of that away because of one conversation on an airplane." Words 63. Her words were delivered without the venom that had marked her earlier statements, but they still carried the weight of decades of prejudice. Travis felt a flash of frustration. He forced himself to remain calm. "I'm not asking you to throw anything away," he replied. "I'm asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, you can hold on to your beliefs while still treating people with kindness and respect." "But what about my rights?" Meredith asked, and Travis could hear genuine confusion in her voice. "What about my right to live according to my conscience? What about my right to raise my grandchildren with proper value? If I start accepting this kind of behavior, what message does that send?" Travis nodded thoughtfully. "Those are fair questions," he acknowledged. "But here's what I'd ask you to consider. What values are you really teaching your grandchildren? Are you teaching them to stand up for what's right? Or are you teaching them to be cruel to people who are different? Are you teaching them about love and acceptance? Or are you teaching them to judge and exclude?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Meredith looked genuinely troubled by it, as if she had never considered the broader implications of her attitude. I want to teach them to be good people," she said uncertainly. "I want them to have strong moral foundation. Then teach them to be kind," Travis said simply. "Teach them to treat people with respect, even when they don't understand or agree with their choices. Teach them that being different doesn't make someone less worthy of dignity." Those are pretty strong moral foundations, don't you think? Beverly squeezed Meredith's hand gently. "He's right, you know," she said softly. "Remember what you always say about treating people the way you want to be treated?" Meredith looked at her friend with surprise, as if she hadn't expected to be contradicted from that quarter. "That's different," she protested weakly. "That's about normal people." "But they are normal people," Travis interjected. "They're just people who happen to love each other. They have jobs, pay taxes, they worry about their families, they laugh, they cry, they dream about the future, just like you and me. The only difference is who they chose to share their lives with." Travis could see that his words were having an impact, but he also sensed that Meredith was fighting an internal battle between her ingrained beliefs and the logic of what he was saying. He decided to try a different approach. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said gently. "Have you ever been in love?" Meredith's expression softened slightly. "Of course I have. I was married to my husband for 42 years before he passed away." There was tenderness in her voice when she spoke of her late husband, and Travis seized on that emotion. "And how did it feel when people respected and supported your relationship? How did it feel when your family and friends celebrated your love?" "It felt wonderful," Meredith admitted, her voice growing quieter. "It felt like we belonged somewhere, like we were part of something bigger than ourselves." She paused, and Travis could see the wheels turning in her mind. "But that's different," she added, though her voice lacked conviction. "That's the way it's supposed to be." Travis shook his head gently. "Ma'am, with all due respect, love is love. The feelings you had for your husband, the joy, the comfort, the sense of belonging, that's exactly what these two gentlemen have for each other. They're not asking you to celebrate their relationship or change your beliefs about it. They're just asking for the same basic respect that you and your husband enjoy." The airplane hummed steadily through the sky, and the passengers waited in silence for Meredith's response. She looked down at her hand, then at Beverly, then at Jake and Marcus, who were still sitting quietly, holding hands again despite everything that had happened. For the first time, she seemed to really see them as individuals rather than as symbols of something she opposed. The moment of decision had arrived, and Travis could feel the tension in the cabin, like a living thing. He had said his piece, made his argument, and now it was up to Meredith to decide what kind of person she wanted to be. But instead of waiting for her response, Travis made a choice that surprised everyone on the airplane, including himself. "You know what?" he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. I have an idea that might work for everyone. He turned to face the entire cabin, addressing not just Meredith, but all the passengers who had been watching the drama unfold. I'm going to make you an offer, ma'am. I'll trade seats with you. You can have my seat in first class, and I'll sit here with Jake and Marcus. A murmur of surprise rippled through the cabin. Meredith's eyes widened, and she looked genuinely shocked by the unexpected offer. I don't understand, she stammered. Why would you do that? Beverly looked equally confused, uncertain whether her friend should accept such a generous gesture from a stranger. Travis smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, his expression was genuinely warm. Because, he said simply, if you really can't find it in your heart to sit next to two people who are just trying to live their lives, then I'll make it easy for you. You can sit up front in comfort, and I'll sit back here with what appears to be excellent company. He turned to Jake and Marcus, who were staring at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. That is, if you gentlemen don't mind having me a seatmate, I promise I'm house-trained and I don't snore too loudly. His gentle humor broke some of the tension, and several passengers chuckled softly. Jake was the first to recover his voice. We would be honored, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But you don't have to do this for us. We can handle whatever happens. Marcus nodded in agreement, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. You've already done so much just by speaking up, he added. Travis shook his head. I'm not just doing this for you, he said. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes, when we see something wrong happening, we have to be willing to put our money where our mouth is. He looked directly at Meredith. So, what do you say? First-class seat? Extra leg room? Better service, and you won't have to sit near anyone who makes you uncomfortable. Meredith sat in stunned silence, clearly wrestling with the implications of accepting Travis's offer. Part of her wanted to take the upgrade. First class was something she had never experienced, and the idea was undeniably appealing. But another part of her recognized that accepting would be an admission that her behavior had been wrong, that she needed to be rescued from a situation of her own making. I don't need your charity, she said finally. But her voice lacked the fire it had carried earlier. I can sit where I am. But even as she said the words, she didn't sound entirely convinced. Beverly leaned over and whispered something in her ear, and Meredith's expression grew even more conflicted. Travis studied her face carefully. It's not charity, he said gently. It's a solution that works for everyone. You get a more comfortable seat. Jake and Marcus get to travel in peace. And I get to sit with two people who seem like genuinely nice guys. Everybody wins. But what about you? Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. You shouldn't have to give up your first-class seat because of this situation. It's not your problem to solve. Travis turned to him with a smile that was both kind and determined. Actually, it is my problem. It's all of our problem. When we see people being treated unfairly and we have the power to do something about it, then it becomes our responsibility to act. He gestured around the cabin. Every person on this airplane had a choice when this started. They could speak up, or they could stay silent. They could stand for what's right, or they could pretend it wasn't happening. Most people chose to stay silent, and I understand that. It's easier, it's safer, and it's not technically their fight. But sometimes, staying silent makes you part of the problem. The weight of his words settled over the cabin like a blanket. Several passengers looked down at their hands, clearly feeling the sting of his gentle rebuke. Others nodded in agreement, recognizing the truth in what he was saying. The confrontation had become about more than just one woman's prejudice. It had become a mirror reflecting everyone's choice and character. Meredith looked around the cabin, seeing for the first time how her behavior had affected not just Jake and Marcus, but everyone on the flight. She saw disapproval in some faces, disappointment in others, and something that might have been pity in a few. The realization that she had become the villain in the story seemed to hit her like a physical blow. I never meant, she began, then stopped. I was raised to believe. She trailed off again, seeming to struggle with thoughts and emotions she couldn't quite articulate. Maybe I should take your seat, she said finally, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the airplane noise. Maybe that would be best for everyone. Travis nodded respectfully. I think that's a wise decision, he said, and I want you to know that I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who was taught certain things, and you never had a reason to question them. But now you do, and what you do with that opportunity is up to you. As Meredith slowly gathered her belongings, preparing to move to first class, she looked one more time at Jake and Marcus. They were still holding hands, still sitting quietly, still radiating the same gentle dignity they had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, the words bursting out of her as if they had been building pressure for some time. The two words hung in the air, and the entire cabin fell silent. Jake and Marcus looked at her with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "I'm sorry," she repeated, louder this time. "You didn't deserve what I said to you. You didn't deserve to be treated that way. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Tears began to flow down her cheeks, and Beverly reached over to comfort her friend. "I don't know if I can change everything I believe overnight," Meredith continued, her voice breaking. "But I can try to be kinder. I can try to remember that you're people, not just ideas I disagree with." Marcus was the first to respond, his voice gentle and forgiving. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "It means more than you know." Jake nodded in agreement, his own eyes bright with emotion. "We all have things to learn," he added. "Thank you for being willing to try." Travis watched the exchange with deep satisfaction. This was what he had hoped for, not a forced apology or grudging compliance, but genuine recognition and the beginning of real understanding. As Meredith made her way to first class, escorted by Rebecca Thompson, the atmosphere in the cabin began to change dramatically. Instead of sitting in the first-class seat Meredith had vacated, Travis squeezed into the middle seat between Jake and Marcus. "So," he said with a grin, "I hear LA is nice this time of year. What brings you guys to California?" The casual, friendly question broke the last of the tension, and soon the three men were engaged in easy conversation about travel, work, and life. Other passengers began to relax as well. Conversations resumed throughout the cabin, and the flight attendants started their service again. But something fundamental had changed. People were looking at each other differently, talking to their neighbors, engaging with strangers in ways they might not have before witnessing the confrontation and its resolution. As the airplane began its descent into Los Angeles, Meredith made her way back through the cabin. She stopped at row 12, where Travis was laughing at something Marcus had said about his job as a graphic designer. "Excuse me," she said quietly. All three men looked up at her. "I wanted to thank you," she said to Travis. "And I wanted to apologize again," she said to Jake and Marcus. "I've been thinking about what you said about my grandchildren and about what kind of values I want to teach them. I think I want to teach them to be more like you three, kind and patient and willing to stand up for what's right. They're lucky to have a grandmother who's willing to grow and change," Jake said warmly. "That's not always easy to do." Meredith smiled through her tears. "No, it's not. But maybe it's never too late to become a better person." As the airplane touched down at LAX, the passengers burst into spontaneous applause. They were applauding the safe landing, yes, but they were also applauding something else. The triumph of human decency over prejudice, the power of courage to inspire change, and the reminder that it's never too late to choose kindness over hatred. Travis, Jake, and Marcus walked off the airplane together, chatting like old friends. Behind them, Meredith walked with Beverly, still dabbing at her eyes, but looking somehow lighter than she had when the flight began. And throughout the cabin, passengers carried with them the memory of a moment when someone chose to stand up for what was right, and how that choice had transformed not just one confrontation, but an entire community of strangers into something better. The lesson was simple but profound. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to speak up, one person willing to stand for what's right, and one person willing to show that love is always stronger than hate. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change everything.